Why in an organized society a government is required? This is the question. In a market economy, normally it has been believed that no need of government, right? There is no requirements of government if under a perfect competitive situation or even an imperfect competitive situation, market can take care of everything. This is what I taught you in the first and second semesters, right? So market can take care of all the economic activities. That means individual by themselves are capable of doing their own economic activity. So the third party existence is literally ruled out from microeconomics framework, which we have already done so far, or you are at least aware of it. Is it agreeable point? Is it an agreeable point? Yeah. In the real work, is it so? Hello. Is it an agreeable point or not? Tell me. Yes. So this is what is actually the microeconomics frameworks tells us that we can have a sort of activity, all kinds of economic activity that can be done by individual. Then the question comes. Then and then only this question comes. Then why we need a government? Why we need a state? Why we need even a family? So this question will come in. So normally in political science class, people taught you like if you had some basic political science understanding, then state is actually just like a family, right? How the family runs is exactly how a state runs. So it is a microscopic unit of a state. That is what is called a family. All right. This is what is in political science people normally try to teach us. That is the case, then the question comes, what is actually the role of government in an economic activity? All right, because our microeconomic activity is completely doing by firms or individual or whoever it is. All right, in that context only this question relevant, otherwise this question makes no sense. Okay, so given that the case, there are many different points people had or having, economists are having, regarding the importance of state. Okay, so what is normally we are going to deal with is actually the Musgravian framework. All right, the importance of government. In my mind, there is no question of actually not government is not at all required. All right, why? Because that is to argue that you don't need a family uh, kind of an induction. Okay, so you can exist as an individual, you don't require a society. So society is actually called a group behavior, whereas an individual is actually an individual behavior. We have already understood all the differences in my group behavior, in the sense that where your action always depends on others action, or your action is always influenced by the other's action. That means there is always an interdependence between individuals. So this we have already seen, especially in the first micro lecture onwards. I keep telling that if people are nice and all, then snatching is not a problem at all, right? If people are very nice, snatching is also not a problem. Am I making sense? If everybody is actually nice to each other, then snatching itself is not a problem, because that is also an economic activity per se. Okay, so you may feel that actually it is a bit old, but it is not actually old, because it's part and parcel of the same economic activity. So this is first of all we have to keep in mind. Now, if snatching is not a problem, then all kinds, even theft is not a problem, right? Because if you want to see in that lens of an individual, then uh, it is okay to all of us. But we are not okay with all of this kind of activity. This kind of activities are or always been treated as not an okay activity at all, right? Am I making sense, Devi? Are you following me? All right. So, what about you, Sri Lakshmi Haridas? Are you following me? Okay. So then it's fine. So the question there comes. The question is very important. The question is very important at that point only. So normally we need a sort of system where we are not very happy. That snatching is not that happy thing, sir. That is where people are interested in some other thing. This is what is actually the basis of the social contract theory of Hobbes. Political science starts there. So original economics is also known as political economy, right? So the whole idea is actually start from that point that in this organized society you can't have a interaction without an interdependence. This is the problem. Okay, so every activity is actually depend on others. Everything is actually depends on others. For example, I do a business not only to gain myself but also to exist in the society, right? So it is not my benefit alone. Because that is the case, let me come with a simple example, which is called the trust game example. I think I had taught you in the class trust game, right? I made a point of or I passively referred to this trust game, right? Trust game is actually a two-party game. All right, let us begin with this. From a microeconomic framework, you have a trust game. Okay, let's play a trust game. Trust game is normally played by two individuals. If you don't have trust, then there is no business. If you do have trust, then only you have business. But trust is actually, is it a selfish act? Trust. You trust a person not because of you gain, or the other person can breach very well because he is also, or he or she is also independent to make their own choice, right? His or her own choice, right? Am I making sense? Hello. Okay. So initially it looks very blurred. All right, the point is very simple. So two individuals, so I have 100 rupees, you have no money, but you can actually have a urge to do business. All right, you don't have money. Suppose this is actually the initial condition. All right, I have money, you don't have money, but I have no urge of doing business, but you have urge of doing business. This is what is called initial condition. Let us start from this initial condition. Now, how do you do a business? If you have trust, okay, let's not go to the trust first. Let us actually talk about the payoff from the game. All right. So if I have 100 rupees but I have no interest in business, all right, but you have no money but you have interest in business, that means if you want to do business, then you have to borrow from me, right? Okay. So if you borrow from me, then you will double the income, say 200 rupees. All right. If you pay back the money, that is 200 plus 50 rupees, that is 50-50 of the profit which you earned, then what I gain is actually 150, that is 50 as profit, and 50, 100 as my initial capital, right? Are you following me? So this is one side, and the next side is actually, yeah, the other person is actually having no money but having an interest, borrowed this money, and so that person is also have two options. A, the person is having two options. A, share the profit or keep the money. Okay, because it is an individual act, right? Share the profit or keep the money. So if I am sharing that is the second person is sharing the profit, then he or she is going to get only 50 rupees. All right. If they keep the money, how much he or she get? 200, right? So for that person, the decision is depends on 50 rupees is always less than 200 rupees, right? At the same time, the person who had lent the money or the person who had capital, uh, he gets actually two options. Either he gets 150 rupees or nothing, right? If the other person, the person who borrowed the money, who don't pay, that means the person who lent the money has nothing, right? Reciprocal case, right? If they share in a good sense, then things are okay, right? So if you see the same thing in a payoff matrix, what an individual's profit maximization function will ask or make you to do is actually keep the money. Okay, the person who want to do business is always have an incentive to keep the money with him. Are you following me? Any doubt? Any doubt, Ashna? Anybody? Any doubt? Doubt on doubt. Are you following me? Okay, perfect. So what does it mean? Business, will the business take place or not? Will the business take place or not? Tell me. Exactly. So there cannot be any business if there is no trust between these two people. So what made this business basically come true is actually something which is a priori to even doing business or selfishness or self-interest or whatever. Okay, that means trust played a crucial role than even borrowing and lending, right? Even borrowing and lending is also depend on what? Trust. Okay, so this is what is called the social norm or what you call the sentiments. Adam Smith wrote his book Wealth of Nation preceded from his work that is the theory of moral sentiments. So he wrote first a book which is called the theory of moral sentiments, where he talked about all these things. He said people are always driven by their own moral sentiments. All right, that moral sentiment is actually a precursor of, which is actually comes under the broader category moral philosophy, where people and society runs based on moral philosophy. Okay, they have their own moral philosophy, and that moral philosophy only make people to work. After this work only, Adam Smith came out with his work, which is called The Wealth of Nation, where he spoke about the self-interest and maximizing behavior of an individual, laissez-faire, etc. Now, this is actually preceded by his own work, saying that first of all, you should have a moral sentiment. You have to believe, you have to trust, you have to well behave. So all that is actually basically guide the individual to do their own acts. That means, a priori to your self interest, you are basically interdependent with your moral sentiments or your legal sentiments. I'll come to the legal sentiments later, because in public economics we hardly talk about legal sentiments. We talk that is only we'll discuss in the law and economics paper if somebody wish to take. So this is actually the first precursor. That is, anybody want to do business, then either they have to have the morality to do business. I mean, it has to drive by a moral sentiments, or it has to be driven by a legal binding. Right. These are the two things which is makes people to do business. The former is called informal social structure. The later is called a formal social structure. So formal social structure like such as law and legal, constitution or even rules, regulations, etc. That is actually makes people to behave promptly. This is one way of looking at the problem. At same time, this is called the something which is actually controls. Who controls or who come up with all this thing? There comes the role of government. All right. Now you cannot see a world without government. Whichever tribe you take, whichever community you take, you cannot have a community existing without a government or a clear cut, well functioning structure which is other than an individual. It is called, it is comes up with a different sort of, uh, you can say, functions. So this is, if it is different sort of functions, means a different set of rules. So this is actually gives rise to a new set of understanding which is called institutional understanding. So I am not going to the details of institutional economics. Now, government is one of that institutional framework, in fact, to be very precise. Now, because the government also operates based on functionalities as well as its own rules and regulations. Okay. So now that is actually not an individual per se. So, but people are nowadays, Avinash Dikshit and many people try to, or many neoclassical economists try to say that no, government also function as a firm or an individual because they themselves are profit maximizing. Even in this paper, in the end of this module, we will discuss about some of this aspect of government maximizing their vote as well as their self-interest, etc. So we will discuss with. But still, as a beginning point, what we need to understand is that government is actually a third party. In a simple sense, it is called a third party. It is basically a third party is nothing but operates based on set of rules. That set of rules are basically found by the same individuals, okay, in the society for their own well-being. Okay, now you know that in India we have elections, but that government is being elected by people, right? So we elect the government, and the government is ruling for us. So this is what is called a representative democracy, where you elect your own representatives and they rule for us. Okay. And they lay down so many rules and regulations, as we say, okay, we have health policy, we have economic policy, we have social policy, we have all kinds of policy. All that has been legislated in the legislative assembly. That is how people's representatives do in the legislative. Now the judiciary as well as the other functions of the state execute it. Judiciary interprets and the executive always execute these kind of rules and regulation. This is how a government works, right? Now, what is in a nutshell the government? Again, it is a function, right? There are different activity they are undertaking. Now, if we come back to our economic question as we began, that is, what the government has to do. So if people are nice and good, they can handle everything well and good. Nothing is going to go wrong, right? So why we need a government again? Many people in the previous lectures and many different classes, that is your seniors and all, they keep telling that, see, we need government. Why we need government is because government is actually supposed to provide a lot of utilities to all of us. Okay, right? Are you? None of you had actually made this point. So government has to provide utilities, which is called public utility. At least in the time of pandemic, you should aware of all this, right? So public utilities are one of the most important functions of the state. Now, what are these for public utilities? The utilities which the private cannot provide. Due to, in a simple sense of economics, is actually having due to externality or transaction cost. So a transaction cost is something which we dealt in the last semester. Of course, the lectures are missing from the semester where I haven't given a lecture on transaction cost. So transaction cost is a cost which happens during the time of your exchange process. Whereas an externality cost is actually a cost or in that sort of a cost or benefit arises due to the process of production and consumption. So one is actually a result of production and consumption. The other one is actually a product uh, of exchange or redistribution. So this is what is called the that is the transaction cost is always a cost of governance. Okay, due to the society's problem of governance, there is a huge cost or there is a cost escalation takes place. That cost has actually always been kind of sunk or it is spread across. So this kind of cost is actually inevitable, and that kind of cost has to be taken care of. So government or different sort of institutions come into place because of this in order to reduce this volume of cost. Okay, this is what is called the transaction cost approach. And many people got Nobel Prize, including Oliver Williamson and many more who worked on transaction cost. Now, the other school is actually about externality, where James Buchanan and many people had wrote about what is externality. Tibor Sitowski and so many people try to conceptualize what is this externality. But the question is, externality always arises when there is production and consumption takes place. Okay, what is the difference between production and consumption vis-a-vis the exchange? The exchange, it is actually a cost arises because of the market transactions. Okay, there is no production but only transaction. Now, in the former, it is always a case with the production and consumption. Okay, that is the difference between externality. But actually, the distinction is a very thin layer. Okay, so this is about the difference between production and consumption issues as well as the exchange issue. That makes the difference between transaction cost and externality. Now, what is the role of government? The role of government is actually to minimize this, or to say that actually there are different kinds of such cost which is either minimize in the sense that it is not necessarily to remove the cost, but to reduce the cost to the extent that it can be afforded, or it can be imputed inside the pricing structure. So this is the point. So we are all aware of, because public economics, one of the functions of the government is actually taxing all of us, right? Tax. Now, why we pay tax? Why we pay tax? Economy develop ചെയ്യാനാണ് ടാക്സ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. എങ്ങനെയാണ് എക്കോണമി ഡെവലപ്പ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് അത് പറയും. എന്തിനാണ് ഗവൺമെന്റ് അങ്ങനെ റവന്യൂ? വൈ ഗവൺമെന്റ് നീഡ് റവന്യൂ? So you are trying to say that the government is actually takes money from the rich and give to the poor. That means redistributing. Tax is a redistribution. Oh, അതാണ് പറയുന്നത്. Very good, because one of the function of the tax is redistribution. Very good. So but why? If people are nice and good, then why should the government to do that? അതല്ലേ നമ്മുടെ ചോദ്യം. നമ്മുടെ ചോദ്യം മനസ്സിലായോ? So our question is very pertinent. Okay, so one of the functions, why do we tax? This is the same. It is not only actually you are taking this money from some person or the polluter. In the externality case, you have heard about Pigouvian tax, right? So Pigouvian tax is nothing but a tax which is actually the polluters pay. Whatever the extent of pollution which some producer made has to be paid by the producer himself or herself. So that would be actually compensated to the person who lost, right? This is what is called a polluter's pay tax, or we call it a Pigwin tax. Now, this is only a redistribution in that sense. Those who are polluting has to be incur the cost which they are basically generated, right? So this is what is actually, but in the modern tax system, it is not like that. Government to do more than what the redistribution is. Okay. So anyway, so the whole question comes there. That is, the tax is not only giving money to the poor, but also if somebody, suppose you are paying a tax, but there is a quality problem in your commodity, so you can sue the person or sue the company, right? Or somebody had given some promise, but it has not been met. You can sue it. How you can sue to? You can sue to government or the institution called judiciary, right? Who is running the judiciary? Government, right? There is an institution. That institution will take care of it. Again, if somebody violates your right, you go to complain in a police station or in somewhere. All right. If it is against you, you go to a police station. Then it is called a crime. But if it is a civil dispute, you go and argue in the court saying that this person is again violated your right. So two type of a problem. One is a criminal problem, the other one is civil problem. So both can be tried in the court, right? You have a criminal court and you have a civil court. So all these things are there. Again, it is actually called the organ of the government. Now, in order to run the government and run this organ, the government need money. That is why you are paying tax. You need education institution. That is why you are paying tax. So out of that tax only salaries and pensions comes. Am I making sense? So all this tax is actually, it is not something redistribution from the rich to poor. Poor person also pay tax, huge amount of tax. For example, if you have a predominant indirect tax like GST and all, everybody pays. So whoever have a higher consumption propensity, they pay the most tax in the case of an indirect tax. Whereas if you have a direct tax, then you have the problem that the richer person pay more money than the poor person. All right? Yeah. Correct. No, you have a different varieties of tax. You have a direct tax as well as an indirect tax. GSA is not a progressive tax. GST is an absolute tax. Person or a poor person, if you buy a commodity, you have to pay that much of money. So there is nothing progress there. It is a tax. Okay. But in case of income tax, your point is actually well taken because rich has to pay more. Okay. So you have different types of tax again. All this tax has been actually not only redistributed, you have utility. That is, as I said in the beginning, that you have public utilities, and that public utility has to be provided. Education, health, road, you have all kinds of infrastructure. Then you have law and order. Then you have other things. Okay. Then again, you have to act as an economic stabilizer. These are actually called the functions of the government, modern function. These are very much part and parcel of this work of the state or work of the government. Okay. Now, if the government want to do all kinds of this work, they need money. That is why they tax. Okay. So tax is not simply for redistribution from rich to poor, but it is having all other functions. Okay, so many functions. These functions are comes under the functions as I began with the statement that Musgravian function, right? We have a Musgravian understanding that no, the allocative function, stabilization function, etc. All right. So these are called the functions of the government. The distributive function. That is what our point. Then you have also resource allocation. What kind of resources can be allocated into which type of production? Is in the microeconomics, the beginning lecture of the microeconomics, the allocative question, right? The question of allocation, what to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce, that question, right? It's a question of allocation. Now who is going to make that a question of allocation? Now a farmer who produces the thing, is really he going to make that decision? So there comes this whole sort of question that my act is not actually an independent act. Again, the person who is actually at the receiving end, the consumer, are they really making this question? Okay, so who is actually making this function? There are different institutions. I won't say that only government is one of the institution, all right? So one of the institution is the most powerful institution, okay, in the structure. So they do have this sort of an allocative function, distributive function, stabilization function, and other functions. We also come to the Keynesian function, growth function, etc. So I'll talk about roughly on that later. So this is the role of government. So the role of government is pretty clear in that sense. They have at least this four functions like allocation, distribution, stabilization, and growth. So growth is actually the last, the fourth early added one. Now this is actually an antithesis of what we had earlier understood. For example, if resources are efficiently allocated, then you cannot have growth. This is what is the question which we keep asking as well as debated in the microeconomics lecture, right? Are you following me? That is, if you want to have a growth, then growth is something which is an improvement from your existing system. All right? Are you following me? Growth means an improvement over our own existing status, right? The condition. Yeah, so that means there is always an efficiency improvement in that sense. That means the earlier every t minus 1 is actually not necessarily efficient as tth period, all right, or t plus 1. All right. So this is actually making the whole question of growth in place, right? The function of the government is some people say development, some people say growth, etc. All right. So these functions are all immediately came into the discussion that the role of government is actually at least fulfills, has to fulfill for main function: allocation, distribution, stabilization. But these three principles are actually Musgravian principle, and their growth was later people try to incorporate. So let us go to one by one. An organized society requires the consumption of public good and a service that would be unprofitable to produce privately. So this is what is actually the basis of our discussion till now. Okay, because our question of production as well as our question of decision making, etc., is not necessarily completely dependent on our own hand. For example, as we said, the state, what the Noel started with saying that the original the function of the state is actually sorry, the government is law and order. So law and order requires a lot of resources in that sense, right? So you need a defense expenditure in that sense. So this money has to come from, these resources has to come from people, right? The state has to get these resources. So that resources they will get in terms of or in the form of taxation and other forms. Okay, land they can grab, and the state can take, which is called the takings. So the state can take land and private. These are called, in that sense, private lands. Okay, that means people are occupied and they displace them. Then they will be actually putting the defense officials there, or your you know bunkers are there, or whatever defense things should be installed there. So then they also have law and order problem, like, they have to employ people to basically ensure that things are smooth and good. And also they have to build infrastructure in order to make all this possible, and the movement perfect, because we all know that railway had made the British to rule India quite well, because that made a swift movement of uh, resources from one end to the other end. So, in that sense, the infrastructure played a very, very crucial role. Where do this money comes from? From, again, people. So, people, the government has to mobilize. So then that is also, so your resources is not no longer your resources. It has to be the government who would decide, the resources and the utilization of resources. No, long back when I was looking into the functions of the state, especially the Travancore state. See, the properties, especially the fruit trees and trees, all trees, kind of trees, are all state property. Of course, it's not a democracy, it's a monarchy. Okay, in the princely state, they had, there is no legislation entitling people to even fell fruit bearing trees or any trees in 16, unless another state can only actually cut the trees. Even if you want to cut the tree, you have to get permission from the state. So later there are series of legislation, especially in 1880s, 90s, entitling people to basically cut the trees. And this is also comes in a framework that, in late 1860s, the state asked the people to migrate. That is, in the forest area, they ask the people to fell the forest and do agriculture and survey the land, etc. So all this was happened in late 1860s. So for that, the state has to give permission to the people to basically, like, for that only they had seriously legislated so many uh, legislation to give power to people to cut the trees, etc. So here also, the custodian of the things are actually state in a monarchy. Okay, so allocation in that context only, you are saying that okay, everything is actually individuals are entitled to do this. Laissez-faire is actually there. What is laissez-faire? Even in Britain, people can't do it. So Britain, the interesting thing is actually the British government is itself is a monarchy, and the East India Company, either the government do or the company will govern. So things are not as laissez-faire as we think. Okay, so everything is controlled either through the state directly or through its own organs. Like East India Company is one of its organ. All the wealth from the world had flown to Britain through East India Company. So East India Company is, in that sense, is a powerful organ of the British Empire. So what I am trying to say that these are called different mechanism of the government to get resources, as well as decide upon the allocation of resources. So allocation of resources in that sense. Okay, so there comes this first function very intact, that is the allocative function. All right. Then comes the second function. This is called the redistributive function. But before that, also a couple of things. That is, taxation is used to raise fund. This is the primary source of income for production of goods and services. Taxation actually act as the primary source of income of any government. And we know that British Empire had got money all across its own, empire. Through this way of taxation in different forms: direct tax, indirect tax, then levy, then even princely state like Travancore has to pay a ransom, annual, tribute. It is called a tribute. That is also a tax, tribute to the British Empire to take care of, or give the freedom of their princely administration. Everywhere things are like that. So all this is what is called the taxation. All right. Now currently the central government is having more share of than the state government. That is actually we will discuss in the devolution as well as the center state relation portion. Okay, so allocation is in that sense a very, very important aspect which government do. Second one is, now all these are called economic activity. None of this is actually not an economic activity. All right, this is all economic activity. You can't simply say that it is not an economic activity. Defense, law and order, infrastructure, then taxation, that is a revenue of the state, then to pay goods and service, etc. Everything is actually being done by the state in that sense. Now, let us come to the second problem, the redistributive function. Very difficult to do in a short period of time. Now, redistribution, as we think that taking money from one person and giving it to the other person, this is not actually going to take place in a speck of a second or in a short period. That is why it is very difficult to do in a short period to redistribute the income which you get from one side to the other side. So redistributing wealth does not change individual income much in that sense. So redistribution is impossible to do via tax system alone. I have already said that. And the redistribution through expenditure system is much more promising in that. So what the government normally do, see, the direct cash transfer and all is actually based on the redistribution of income from one point to the another. But there are different issues. But this is actually not from one exact sources which you tap the resources and giving it to the other sources. Nothing doing. All right, that is technically is not going to work because there are others sources maybe get delayed, but having higher income which will help you to. So the rolling is always takes place as far as the state is concerned or government is concerned. Therefore, this readily transferring from one point to another is not necessarily going to happen. This is true. For example, the recent performance of the state and the Indian economy is a classic case of this. Now the government of Kerala is having a cash crunch in all front because of so many reasons: lockdown, sluggishness in the growth, then GST, hazards like money redistribution delay, etc. All this kind of problems are there. What the government done is actually the corpus funds of different autonomous institutions has been taken by government through a legislation. Simple. They have taken and made us the, for example, the university, all the university, at least the 12 universities, major universities, or all 17, including smaller one, all these universities had some corpus fund. Now they don't have that corpus fund. Now that is with the treasury. So the government had taken all the money, and now the institution has to wait for their bill being passed by the treasury. So things are become more complex there. Now, what does this indicate? It says that because of the cash crunch on one point or one slot, now the government is actually taking money from the other slot, and they are trying to meet the expenditure. Because of the COVID and all, we know that the income had strictly fallen. I think almost 80, the planning board study says that in the last 2 months, income loss itself is 80,000 crores. So it's a huge amount. 80,000 crore means 2 years budget, total expenditure, okay, or budgetary provisions of the state. So this has been curtailed in a moment of 2 months because of the imposition of lockdown. So things people have a large amount of income loss due to this. Now, how do we manage this? So these are the question of the distribution, or these are the distributive questions normally we encounter. Now, then redistribution to expect. So, what the government to do is actually they have to spend very, very sharply. They have to spend more. So, if they spend, then spending means government rationalize spending. And if they rationalize spending, then they know that which area has to have a higher propensity, and people will come and get people receive income, and that received income would be spent. So, based on that, the government has to make a decision. So that expenditure is going to be actually grease the economy, so or the economic activity. So redistribution should be related to the role of government in promoting growth. So that is what is the third, the objective of. Now why the government has to do is actually then the government, the redistribution should basically smoothen this whole sort of production or growth per se. So only through growth can people in developing countries or developed country be lifted out of economic problems or the income, income loss. So now in this context, it is quite clear that because of the imposition of high level of restriction, or we call the lockdown, the people have actually had a high level of income loss. How do we manage this income loss? That has to be done through redistribution. So public, then people may not be having income for at least short period. Then you have your health may get deteriorated, especially in a health havoc like this. So the government has to spend there, as well as if there is a problem of education, then people are saying that okay, you cannot come and contact, so then you have to promote online. So what government has to do, they have to provide income, sorry, they have to spend money in such an area that they haven't spent earlier, such as online class smart, making classrooms smarter, and providing people, the students, infrastructure of getting access of the same, etc. So these are the kind of new way redistribution of income takes place, or the redistribution of income has to be in that line. And rural roads, rural telephone, electricity, and public water supplies all are all ways that people can change in life over time. So important to consider change in income distribution there also. And then the government is having also the point of short-term objectives such as stabilizations. So the other two things, that is, I have said the allocation and the redistribution is long-term, whereas the stabilization function of the state, the government is state or government is actually to meet short-term objective, like monetary policy, again short-term fiscal policies, etc. So we will see that. That is, now if you reduce the repo rate or reverse repo rate, then if you increase the reverse repo rate and repo rate, so how that is going to increase the money supply or reduce the money supply, etc. Now how that is loops the credit availability and credit crunch, etc. So all this is kind of then increasing SLR, statutory liquidity ratio, all kinds of monetary policies are in fact, in that sense, short-term stabilization mechanism, which is also doing by the state or government. Now, again, the main objective to keep actual level of income close to its potential. This is what is actually the objective of the stabilization. Now, we know that the economy, if the economy slip into recession, or if they are having a sort of investment crunch or consumption paralysis, etc., then there is a possibility of piling up of resources, especially the produced output. We call it the glut in the economy. So if there is a glut in the economy takes happens, then it is going to have a lot of layoff. That is, there is a lot of labor layoff are going to take place, and if that is the case, then your income level will come down again, because many people will be losing their job. That means they don't have an income in that front. Even if you have an income, then that income would be insufficient to basically meet your daily requirements. So if that is the case, then it will pose a demand crunch on the other side. Again, it will make the economy move a little bit slow. So this is what is called a recessionary slip of an economy. So government has to stabilize, or the stabilization policy should be a policy to correct this sort of a trajectory, or what that is what Keynes said. Growth should be the kind of objective the government has to keep. This is what is called the fourth objective. So inflation extremely damaging to poor and reduces the efficiency of market. Now, inflation is not only actually give damage to the poor, but also it is actually affects everyone. All right. So then, as we said, this is also going to affect the growth process in the economy. And the government do have a very, very important and strong role to play at that point. And probably the most important objective when per capita income are low, source again, if you have a lesser income, then you don't spend, as I said earlier. If you have lesser income because of an underemployment, or because of your knowing employment, your per capita income will fall, then that will affect the production as well as consumption of the economy, because it will consumption, and that consumption will also affect the production process. And so tools of taxation and public expenditure need to be focused on how to promote growth in that. And this is what does everyone ask. And they need policies that encourage investors to reinvest their business surplus, not take them out of country. And government budget surplus important for providing savings for private sector to borrow. So the government's policy of actually sort of helping people's saving capacity, as well as their investment capacity, that's all depends on what is actually the short term and long term policy which the government come. So there are other issues of innovation policies which the government has to do in order to keep this thing in. The first and foremost thing is very simple. That is, avoid false technicalism in economic policy making. Making people that okay, something which we are doing is far greater than anybody else. No, economic policy, whether X is doing something or Y is doing, it is having a sort of a fixed effect in that sense. So all kinds of technicalism has to be avoided. So again, budgets under adequate control. So you should know that what you are spending and where you are spending, etc. should be. So you can't simply say that okay, this much of money we are going to spend. But if you don't spend, then that is not actually comes under sort of a sound budgetary policy. So inflation, and that is other problems like inflation pressure should be kept under control. And international trade has to be, have a very strong role. Especially at this point, we know that there is no international trade taking place. Okay, most of the international freight movement is standstill. Now it is going to slowly start, but the income loss due to this particular what you call the lockdown is in that sense enormous. So many other there are other trade patterns like trade restrictions are far worse than the other things, and we are seeing it because whether we like it or not, our commodity has to travel, whether it is internal, and you people maybe if the shop, then you feel the brunt, right? If you have a daily purchaser, then you will feel the brunt. Otherwise, those who can stock the thing and all, they don't feel a severe problem. but the daily consumer will feel this is the same effect which have an international trade also. So if import restrictions are excessive and reducing them is politically impossible, mount an indirect attack on problem by increasing incentive to export. So many problems will pop up. So there are other issues, but all trivial thing, and I have already pointed most of this. Now, there are policies that is such as tax policies which government has to come out in that kind of situation to tackle the thing. So government cannot simply forget or they say that okay, forgo the tax. If the government forgo the tax, it simply indicates only one fact that was actually the government don't want to spend. If I am foregoing the tax means I don't want to spend. So I am giving incentive to the other person, but the other person's limit of spending is also limited, especially when the economy is at a slower pace. But at the same time, if the economy is in a boom situation, they keep spending on. So the government has to make a sort of rational decision in this regard. Then only the stabilization and the growth aspect will be met, as well as the that is depends on the earlier to point, that is the allocation and redistribution. It is depends on the allocation and redistributive function of the state. So with this, I'll stop the lecture right now because this is what is the first part of the story, and I'll keep continuing it. And the lecture is going to next lecture. This is only an introductory thing, and next lecture I'll go to the details of all this government as a tool for operational planning process, etc. So